Okay, so from this stage now, the one thing I want to say again is that everything that is underneath, all of the blue washes, the underpainting, that's all completely dry, and that's all been laid in at this point, up until this point, with liquid and thinner primarily as my medium. From here forward, I tend to shift out of using a lot of liquid and use just linseed oil on the palette. And the reason I do that is because the palette itself can last for a few days. The painting will dry because of the layers underneath that were done with liquid that are adjacent to these top layers. Even though they don't have liquid in them, they're still affected by that chemical reaction a little bit. So while the painting will dry every day, the palette will not. So it gives me just a little bit, I get sort of a second shot at using some of the strings of color. And I'll talk about that a little later when I'm painting the dolphins and just using environmental colors that I already have on my palette. So basically it's just, it's while it does still dry and I can move into a dry painting every day, it lets me save the paint on the palette. Here I've laid in a little bit more detail over the underpainting, mostly in the middle tone gray on the far top back turtle dragon there. And as I'm painting this blue gradation in the background, which is really about 4 values of blue, I'm able to soften or work the edges a little bit as I'm kind of laying in this gradation. Now, I don't worry about that everywhere. And you can see in and around the dolphins of the upper guy, the back turtle dragon, that I'm not real careful about painting around the edges and that kind of thing, because the paint is still thin enough that, you know, and I don't know if you can see it in the video, but if you get up close to this, I can still see the underdrawing and the underpainting that's underneath this thing. So I'm really focused more on the brushwork in the gradation and in the negative space in this piece. And you'll see that I kind of peck back and forth and work the gradation a little bit here and there. I'm not looking for a real smooth transition. I'm looking for something that has kind of a painterly quality. The brushwork in it, to me, looks a little bit more natural than if it was just a real smooth airbrush-like gradation. I see some guys work oil like that, and it's just not for me. I'm not. I don't mind if it looks like a painting when it's done. I'm not trying to work out every fingerprint of the brushwork that I'm doing. I mean, in fact, I'm trying to leave that in there and have that be present in the final piece. Again, on the gradation in the background and the negative space, for the most part, I think this is about a 1/2 inch flat that I'm using. I use chiseled, which are angular flats. I also use filberts, which are great for detail and getting points, little pointy details out of. And of course, for the final details, I use smaller rounds, number 1, number 2 rounds. I usually don't need to go too much smaller than that. Years ago, I used to use 000s and 50s and all this kind of thing. I've kind of gotten away from that over the years. I think it can be a little mind-numbing. And the truth is that, and I don't know who said this, but you want to use the biggest brush you can until you can't use that anymore. And I think that is appropriate a lot of times. If you really focus on these little details, you can just get lost in it. The colors that I'm using too, I want to talk about that a little bit. I used to use a lot of different blues in my palette: cobalt blue, ultramarine blue. There's a million of them, Prussian blue. But these days, I primarily use phthalo blue as the blue on my palette. I tend to mix phthalo blue with white and make a lighter blue, which is very close to cerulean. a cerulean blue, and I do that on the palette, and I use that as a mixing color. But I find that the phthalo blue reproduces very well. It's a very intense color. It can remain very opaque when it's mixed with white. You know, even when it's diluted and thinned down, it covers very well. It can be, you know, from a color perspective, it can be knocked to the violet side or the green side of blue pretty easily by, you know, adding either violet. A lot of times I use manganese violet, and the green is a color that I do use several of, but a lot of times, again, to neutralize the phthalo blue, you can use something like Payne's gray, which will still stay blue but just sort of dull it down, dull the chroma down a little bit, or you can get into adding something like burnt umber, which can go a little green. You have to be careful of it, but it's another way to neutralize the chroma of that very, very strong pigment. As I'm painting over these areas too, I generally start a little off of the main figure. You know, I'm not going right up to the edge of the figure, or the creature in this case, right away. I kind of lay in around the area, and then the paint on the palette or on the piece is enough to get in there and finish painting small areas, as you can see, without having to go back to the palette to reload the brush. Again, at this point, I'm really just using pigment and linseed oil as my primary medium. You can see there are times when I kind of look like I'm moving around, but I'm not putting any paint down. And, you know, there are times when I'm just kind of trying to draw through something. It's almost like trying to line up a golf shot or a shot when you're playing pool. You know, you're just kind of working through where it's going to be before you actually lay any paint down. So I'm kind of I'm looking at my reference and back to the piece, I'm sure, and just trying to discover the little rhythms and patterns that happen in the subject. Of course, with oil paint, unlike digital, you know, we have no Command Z, so, you know, it's, you know, to my advantage to try and be as sure as I can before I start blocking a lot of things in. And of course, that doesn't mean that this medium can't be corrected, and that's, you know, something else I should talk about. One of the reasons that I work in this sort of thin layers that I build up is that, and have them dry and build those layers up rather than going for a more alla prima approach and trying to paint everything in one pass, is that many times frankly, I just don't know what I'm doing right out of the gate. You know, I have to kind of nudge the thing to finish and let the piece show me kind of what's happening, what some of the relationships are going to be, whether the form is working or isn't working. And I can tell that better and better by each subsequent glaze that I put on a painting. So not only does it help me work things out, but as I'm working into something, if I don't like what happens, I can always take a rag and just wipe it out and get back to where I was at the beginning of that day, when, you know, if the painting is dry. So that's a big advantage, and it's one of the reasons that I like to work the way that I do. Now you can see the upper turtle dragon in the distance there. I'm starting to lay in some other colors and some more detail, more linear detail around the shell, some of the shell segments. And what I'm doing here is I have a palette that is some environmental color, some of the colors from the background, the blue and the water, and also some colors that have been mixed, the warm sort of gray violet that he's made up of. Now, while the value of the string I have on my palette is similar to what this creature is, the color's not a dead-on match for what it is. So what happens is I wind up seeing little bits of the underpainting show through, and then I have the added color that I'm using here, and ultimately he'll wind up looking a little more multifaceted in his color rather than just a straight, very sort of monochromatic string of color going from light to dark, like these are just shades of blue, for example. That's where you can see we have the darker shadows that are bluer, and then the warmer tones in the middle, and then back to the blue highlight. Here you can see where I'm starting to work back into the back fins of the upper turtle dragon, and I'm really starting to soften and concentrate on throwing some of the edges and lightening the value in the background, on the background turtle dragon, so that the head of the main turtle dragon will come forward, and all of the contrast and all of the attention will wind up being there in the final piece. And again, like painting this background guy to finish the first time through would have been difficult because I just didn't have enough value. I didn't have enough information laid in this thing to make some of these judgments. But now I'm at a point where I can, and it's a lot easier to move forward. You can see here too, I want to mention this is a multitude of maul sticks at work here. Just the way my easel is built, I have the one large vertical piece all the time, and sometimes it's more of a hassle to move it around. So I have these smaller 3/4 inch dowel rods that are great that I just kind of lean on there. So, and I'm usually only using the maul stick when I'm in on some detail areas, and even this I'm still kind of away from it a little bit, but I like these long handle brushes. Most of the time when I'm blending paint, I'm either blending with a clean brush or a cleanish brush, or I'm blending with, assuming it's not just a wet into wet paint, or I'm blending with a brush that has just clear medium on it. That's if I'm blending wet paint into a dry area, into an already finished layer that's dry. I used to feather down with a large soft brush. A lot of times we used to call it dusting it down, and that can soften it quite a bit and really feather. It can really make things look like airbrush. I mean, you can get to a point where there's just no discernible brush work at all with that method, but I've gotten away from that in my, I don't know what to say, my older years. It's just, I really am just not afraid to leave the brush work in there. It was something that I think I felt like it needed to be worked out of it originally when I was younger, but I don't feel that way now. Now I really want to see the technique more. I also flip the piece, and not just this piece, but any piece I'm working on. I have a tendency to flip them on their side, upside down. Not only does that help just with brush direction, which you can kind of see, noodling in around the dolphins. It's just helping get in some of those little corners and things like that. But I also find that painting objects sometimes in a way that is not oriented in the way that you're normally used to looking at it can help lend reality to something. Sometimes I'm just looking at something purely as an object and not so much as what the object is. I hope that makes sense, but it really helps. For example, in the guy here in the background now, I can see the light on his back developing, and it looks like the light's coming from the right if the piece is sitting on its side like this. Of course, the light is coming from the top, but it's just a way that when you have hours and hours into these paintings, it's just a way to get kind of a fresh perspective on it. At this point, because again, I'm not really doing a lot of detail work. This is probably about a 1/2 inch flat brush. And you can turn it on its side and get a little smaller detail. It's great for, getting in some of these little nicks and nooks and corners that are in between the fins. But it's big enough that I think it helps lend a sense of movement when you're laying in the brushwork to the gradation. What I'm not going for in that gradation is a completely polished airbrush-like finish. I like seeing the little brush strokes. Hopefully there's not a lot of pattern to them. I mean, there's something to be said for how they're manipulated in order to get the eye to look in the right place, to soften certain areas, to help focus, and to help the movement in the piece. I also think that if the gradation were too smooth, it just seems to look a lot less. It looks very artificial to me. I just don't. When I look at photography and I look at reference of underwater stuff, it never is that way. There's always just some subtle little differences in it. Even though, as you can see from laying in this, more of the gradation in the upper right-hand portion here, that there's really about 3 or 4 tones to this blue as we go down. But again, I'm trying to keep the major focus of this piece. I mean, the major focus is the upper body of the center turtle dragon. So I'm trying to keep the lighting there, the spotlight, the lighting there. I'm also trying to keep the edges on the guys in the background a little softer so that he will project forward, as well as the most contrast there. The lightest blue with the blackest, which really isn't black, but the darkest dark on the upper skull of the turtle dragon. In and around these areas, especially when I first start laying down color and I'm away from the subject a little bit, I tend to go a little bit heavier on the medium and stuff, just to make sure that everything's fairly wet. Now, at this point, I'm using, I would say at this point, I'm probably using just linseed oil, because the layers that are underneath were all done with liquid, and that permeates through the top layers. So this will still pretty much be dry the next day. And as I find that, the liquid, as I get down and I'm working a little more carefully and more slowly through the process, the liquid can bind a little too quickly. So I'm really looking for about probably 5 hours of work time maximum at any one point. Okay, so now here we are. The background is is pretty laid in. There's not a lot of finished detail on the background figures, other than maybe one pass on the main turtle dragon. So that's really what we're kind of trying to do here. I'm starting to really define this guy in the front and get what is a real, a more finished value study. I'm going to take it as dark as I'm going to take it. Those are things. I could have done that with the brown, but I may just have been a little unsure about it at that point, about how dark it was going to go. Now, through the series of different layers and different stages, it kind of tells me how dark it needs to be, or at least within a certain range how dark I can make it. Trying to just start to suggest, especially because at this point I know I'm going to go over a lot of things, I'm just starting to work in a scale pattern or texture, even though I know a lot of this is going to get covered. It just gives me a little bit of a first taste of how this paint is all going to go down. Sometimes you start to lay something in, it looks fantastic, and you think, oh, this is going to go well, and and hopefully it does. Sometimes you lay stuff down and you think, all right, we're going to need some more reference for this area. So okay, so let's talk about glaze and color. I mean, it's something that at this point the neck on the main creature has already been done, just a little bit of yellow over it, and then a little bit of finish that you can see there. But really, this guy in the foreground is this color that's going over it is more transparent than you really see. It feels like it's a lot darker, but it's just a matter of starting to just control the value a little bit more. I want to pop the highlight a little bit more. So it is a very translucent green, but it is slightly darker on the edges, just to give it the form. And again, as I'm kind of laying this in, because I've taken a crack at it before, I sort of know about what I'm going to do with the brushwork simulating the texture on the neck. With these flat brushes, especially in around like I said, between about 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 inch, you can get little diamond shapes that start to suggest scale texture. So, and then again here you can kind of see, where I'll take a brush that might be loaded with a little green and finish it up into the violet, the more red violet of the breast shell a little bit. And again, that just moves some of the color around and makes things not seem quite as monochromatic, meaning that, that neck. And now, I think it's a little more apparent here with that green through the neck, because you can still see in the shadows and the transition, you can see some of that violet brown showing through and all of that, where I wouldn't have gotten that result coming through it alla prima or in one pass. And then again here, here, this is a pretty small, this is a real small, it's an angled, I forget what they call them, a chiseled end. Still, a flat, so it can, to some degree, in that family, so it can be turned on its side, but you can see here how, it starts to look like little scales, which is cool. And so I'm going to start to play with that. Now, I don't want everything to look the same. I don't want the same definition throughout them all. In the highlighted areas, a lot of times you have more definition than in shadow areas. That's just in general. That's the way we seem to see things. So as I work this, I am going to soften some edges more and fight for detail in areas a little bit more, primarily in the highlighted areas. Okay, so at this point, we're getting down to it. Fixing up some fins in the background. And again, these are just little things, the background details, especially that back fin that's off to the right, that's just the fin, that could have been just a silhouette that was a color that was in the gradation of the blue water in the background. But, I chose to move it a little more forward. But again, that's kind of something that the piece sort of suggests to you now, how, where do you want it to go? Now here we go. This is, one of the, I do get in there with a couple of rounds. This is probably a number 1 or 2 round for little details. I also like small filberts for details. This is, I think, a number 2 filbert, which you can get some pretty good detail too, because they, when they're new or well cared for, you can get a pretty decent point and still get quite a bit of paint on them. Something here with this dolphin, I've been thinking about this for a while as this painting was moving forward. I wanted to have some overlap and just have something overlapping this guy in the front, just to help the painting have a little more depth. And this is something that I spoke about earlier. I wasn't real sure about, I have a piece of reference for this dolphin, but I'm winging it here. And if I don't like the way it turns out, or the tail looks a little funky, or something happens, and I think that I think that you'll see that it does here in a minute, I have the ability to just wipe back into the piece without the dolphin there. So, that's, to me, one of the safeties about, moving forward in this manner. You're just not committed to everything at one time. What I've done here, though, is, I laid this guy in basically in his shadow, and I'm just kind of working the highlights out of him, for the most part using environmental colors and some of the shell color that I have. Dolphins are kind of the silvery gray, so they're not, color-wise, he's not going to stand out that much at this point too. It's really, the silhouette is an important thing, of the dolphin. That's really what we're seeing in this thing from these little guys moving through. They could almost be just a school of fish, but I wanted to do a little bit more than that. You can see how I kind of chisel out the highlight of the fin, and the same thing with more or less, going for the same kind of lighting pattern that's hitting the big drag. The one texture that makes the dolphins seem a little more realistic is, even underwater, they always seem shiny and wet, and basically we just noodle him around until, he starts to look like Flipper. As we move forward into the Dragons of Nature project, I'm going to be releasing a very limited number of prints with remarked drawings on them. We believe that those numbers are going to be as low as 25 prints, so all of that information will be available on the website as we release them.